They mocked the human's old-school rifle until the alien arena went silent and the commander stood up. The transport ship descended through clouds of red dust, and the human inside felt the metal floor shake beneath his boots. His name was Thomas. Mercer and he had been a soldier on Earth before they came and took everything from him. The aliens called themselves the Dominion, and they had arrived 3 years ago, with ships that blocked out the sun and weapons that turned entire cities to ash in seconds. Earth had fought back, but it was like throwing rocks at a hurricane. Thomas remembered the day his squad died around him, and he remembered the promise he made to each of them as the light left their eyes. He would survive, and he would find a way home no matter what it took. The transport door opened with a hiss and bright light flooded inside. Guards with 4 arms and skin like dark blue metal shoved Thomas forward, and he stumbled onto a platform overlooking the largest structure he had ever seen. It was an arena, and it stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands upon thousands of aliens filled the seats, and their voices created a sound like thunder that never stopped. A guard pressed the translator device against Thomas's neck, and suddenly he could understand the words being shouted from the crowd. They were betting on death. "Welcome to the Crucible, human," said a tall creature with a face full of mandibles and eyes like black glass. This was Weapons Master Drawl, and he was responsible for arming the conscripts who would fight and die for the entertainment of the Dominion. "You will select your weapon from the armory, and then you will enter the arena with the others." Drawl led Thomas through a corridor lined with weapons that glowed and hummed with energy. There were plasma rifles that could burn through steel and neural disruptors that could stop a heart from 50 meters away. There were blades that vibrated so fast they could cut through anything, and shields that could absorb the heat of a small star. Thomas looked at all of them, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out the one thing the Dominion had not taken from him. It was a rifle with a wooden stock worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. The metal was old but well maintained, and the action still worked as clean as the day it was made over 100 years ago. "What is that?" Drawl asked, and his mandibles clicked with what Thomas now understood was laughter. "Springfield M1903. Thomas said quietly. "Bolt action and 30 caliber, and it belonged to my grandfather." Drawl stared at the weapon like it was a joke he did not understand. "You wish to enter the Crucible with that primitive thing?" "Yes, our plasma rifles can fire 300 rounds per minute and never overheat, and your weapon requires you to manually chamber each round." "I know. You will die in the first 30 seconds." Thomas said nothing and simply checked the action of his rifle and loaded 5 rounds. From the leather pouch at his hip, Drawl made a sound that might have been a sigh and waved his hand toward the arena entrance. "Very well, human, and may your death at least be amusing." Thomas walked through the entrance and emerged onto sand that was stained with colors. He did not want to think about the roar of the crowd hit him like a physical force, and he had to steady himself against it. Around him stood 19 other conscripts from a dozen different worlds. There was a Crethar with 4 arms and muscles like cables of steel and skin that looked like it could stop a bullet. There was a Siluran with no legs, but a tail like a snake and glands in its throat that could spit acid 30 meters. There was a creature made entirely of what looked like living crystal, and another that seemed to be mostly teeth and claws. They all carried the advanced weapons from the armory, and they all looked at Thomas with something between pity and contempt. The Crethar made a rumbling sound in its chest. "The human carries a stick that throws metal," it said to the others. "Perhaps it will serve as a distraction while the rest of us fight." Laughter rippled through the group, and Thomas felt their eyes on him like the weight of stones. He did not respond, and he did not try to defend himself. He had learned long ago that words meant nothing, and only actions could prove a man's worth. High above the arena floor, in an observation booth lined with gold and precious metals, Commander Vark Thomases watched the conscripts with ancient eyes. He had lived for 300 years, and he had seen 1,000 species enter the crucible. Most of them died screaming and begging. And that was the entertainment the crowd paid for. But something about the human caught his attention. It was not the primitive weapon, though. That was certainly unusual. It was the way the creature stood there. Was no fear in its posture, and no desperation in its eyes. It stood like a predator, waiting and watching and patient. In a way that made Thomas's feel strange. "Commander," said Sub-Commander Yeel from her station beside him, "the odds makers have set the human at 500 to 1 against, and shall I place your usual wager?" "No," Thomas said, and he leaned forward in his throne. "Not yet. I want to watch this one." Down on the arena floor, the massive doors at the far end began to grind open. The crowd's roar intensified, and Thomas could hear individual words now. They were chanting for blood. He looked at the other conscripts and saw them spreading out and raising their weapons. The Krethar was already charging its plasma cannon, and the Siluran was flexing the muscles in its acid glands. Thomas did none of these things. Instead, he looked around the arena and studied the terrain. There were pillars of crumbling stone scattered across the sand, and there were walls half destroyed that could provide cover. There was a large structure near the eastern edge that rose high above the floor. Thomas began walking toward it while the others prepared to fight in the open. "Where are you going, human?" The crystal creature called after him. Thomas did not answer. Had made a promise to his dying squad, and he intended to keep. I would survive this arena. He would find a way home, and anyone or anything that stood in his way would learn the same lesson that humanity had taught itself through 10,000 years of war. The most dangerous weapon was not the one with the most power. It was the one held by someone who refused to die. They mocked the human's old-school rifle until the alien arena went silent and the commander stood up. The doors finished opening, and for a moment there was only darkness beyond them. Then the sounds began. It was a clicking and chittering noise, like a million insects rubbing their legs together, and it grew louder with every second. Thomas reached the pillar he had been walking toward and began to climb. The stone was rough and cracked, and it gave him plenty of handholds by the time the first creatures emerged from the darkness. He was already 10 meters off the ground and wedged into a position where nothing could approach him from behind. The things that poured out of the tunnel were called Sketh, and they were nightmares given form. Each one was about the size of a large dog, but they moved on 6 legs that ended in hooks sharp enough to tear through armor. Their bodies were covered in hard shells of black chitin, and their heads were nothing but jaws designed to bite and tear and consume. There were hundreds of them. The crowd screamed with delight as the swarm spread across the arena floor like a tide of death. Other conscripts opened fire immediately. Plasma bolts lit up the air in bright blue streaks, and neural disruptors hummed as they sent invisible waves of energy into the mass of creatures. Died by the dozens, but there were always more to take their place. Thomas watched from his perch, and he did not fire. He counted. He observed. He waited. The Krethor was doing well at first, and its 4 arms allowed it to fire 2 weapons at once, while using the other 2 to crush any Sketh that got too close. But the creatures were learning, and they began to circle around and attack from angles the Krethor could not cover. Thomas saw one of them leap onto the alien's back and sink its jaws into the joint where arm met shoulder. The Krethor roared and tore the creature away, but the damage was done. Blue blood sprayed across the sand, and the arm hung limp and useless. Siluran was faring better, and it used its acid to create a zone of death around itself that no Sketh would enter. But Thomas could see the alien's movements growing slower, and he knew that the acid glands would eventually run dry. The crystal creature was already dead, and a dozen Sketh had shattered it into pieces that glittered in the arena. Lights through other conscripts had fallen as well, and their screams had been short and terrible. Thomas raised his rifle. The weight of it was familiar and comforting, and he had held this weapon since he was 12 years old, when his father first taught him to shoot. He remembered his father's voice, calm and patient, as he explained the principles that would save Thomas's life 1,000 times over. Breathe slow and steady, find your target, squeeze the trigger, and do not pull the first shot. Cracked across the arena like thunder. Every creature in the arena, both predator and prey, flinched at the sound. It was not the hiss of plasma or the hum of a disruptor. It was something older and more violent, and it spoke of a time when death was delivered in fire and smoke, and Lita Sketh dropped with its head, destroyed. Thomas worked the bolt, and the spent casing flew through the air and caught the light as it fell. He breathed, and he aimed, and he fired again. Another Sketh fell. The crowd had gone quiet, and Thomas could feel their confusion, even from his position high above the sand. They did not understand what they were seeing. They had never heard a weapon like this. Crack another, kill, crack another. Crack the 5th round, found its target, and Thomas reloaded in 3 seconds flat. His hands moved without thought and performed the motions they had practiced 10,000 times. 5 more rounds slid into the rifle, and the bolt closed with a solid click. He resumed firing. Each shot was precise, and each shot was lethal, and Thomas did not waste a single round. He had learned long ago that ammunition was precious, and that a soldier who sprayed bullets like water would soon find himself empty and dead. The Sketh began to notice him. A group of them broke away from the main swarm and started climbing the pillar toward his position. Thomas had expected this. He shifted his aim and put rounds through the first 3 climbers, and they fell and knocked others loose as they went. The remaining Sketh hesitated, and that hesitation was all Thomas needed. He picked them off one by one until the pillar was clear. Below him the battle was turning. The conscripts who had survived the initial rush were starting to find their footing, and the Sketh swarm was thinning. But it was not the plasma rifles or the neural disruptors that had turned the tide. It was the thunder. Every time Thomas fired, the Sketh flinched, and their coordination broke, and the other conscripts gained precious seconds to recover. Commander Thomas's stood at the window of his observation booth and watched with eyes that had seen more death than most species would see in their entire histories. "What is that weapon?" he asked quietly. Sub-Commander Yale consulted her datapad with trembling claws. "It appears to be a chemically propelled projectile launcher, Commander, and the records indicate humans used such weapons before they developed more advanced technology. It is ancient." "Yes, Commander, and by our standards, it is barely more sophisticated than a thrown rock." Thomas has watched the human fire again and watched another Sketh die. "Then why is it so effective?" Eel had no answer. The last of the Sketh finally broke and fled back into the tunnel from which they had come. The crowd sat in stunned silence. 6 conscripts remained standing. Crethar had lost its arm and was bleeding badly, but it would survive. The Siluran was exhausted, and its acid glands were empty, but it was alive. 3 others had managed to find defensible positions and fight off the swarm through luck or skill, or both. High on his pillar, Thomas Mercer sat with his rifle across his knees, and he was utterly untouched. Not a scratch, not a drop of blood. He had fired 47 rounds and killed 47 Sketh, and he had done it all from a position of perfect safety. The other conscripts looked up at him, and there was no contempt in their eyes now. There was something else, something that looked almost like hope. Thomas climbed down from the pillar and walked across the blood-soaked sand to where the survivors had gathered. The Crethar looked at him with new eyes. "You did not fight with us, human." "No," Thomas agreed. "I fought smart. That weapon of yours, and what is it?" Thomas looked down at the rifle in his hands, and for a moment he saw his grandfather's face and heard his father's voice. "It is a promise," he said, "and it is the reason I am going to survive this place and go home." The Crethar made a sound that might have been respect. "Then perhaps, human, you are not as weak as you appear." Thomas did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted. "I never said I was weak," he replied. "I just let you assume And high above in his booth, Commander Thomas's finally sat back in his throne. Interesting, he murmured to himself. Very interesting. He had seen 1,000 species enter the crucible, and he had seen them all die sooner or later, but this human was different. This human might actually be dangerous. They mocked the human's old-school rifle until the alien arena went silent and the commander stood up. 3 days passed in the crucible, and Thomas Mercer was still alive. The arena masters had taken notice. Their algorithms had predicted the human would die in the first round, and yet here he was, having survived not only the Sketh Swarm, but 2 more challenges after that. The second round had been a maze filled with traps and poison gas and creatures that hunted by sound. Thomas had moved through it like a ghost and made no noise and left no trace. He had found a high point near the center and waited for the other threats to eliminate each other. When only 2 remained, he had killed them both with single shots from 400 meters away. The third round had been a simple battle royale where the conscripts were forced to fight each other until only half remained. Thomas had not participated at all. He had climbed to an unreachable position and waited while the others tore each other apart. Below, when it was over, he climbed down and walked past the survivors without a word. The crowd did not know what to make of him. Some had started to cheer when he appeared, and others booed and hissed because he refused to give them the spectacle they craved. But all of them watched him now. The human with the ancient weapon had become a mystery, and mysteries were valuable in the Crucible. Commander Thomas's had requested a full report on the human species, and what he learned disturbed him in ways he could not fully explain. Humans were young, and their civilization was barely 10,000 years old. They had no natural weapons and no armor and no venom or acid, or any of the things that made other species dangerous. They were soft and fragile, and they lived short lives that flickered out like candles in the wind, and yet they had survived. They had not just survived but thrived, and they had done it by being more stubborn and more adaptable and more willing to suffer than any species had. A right debate report contained a phrase that stuck in Thos's mind. Persistence predators. Humans had evolved as creatures that chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They did not need to be faster or stronger, because they simply never stopped. Thos looked down at the arena floor where the 4th round was about to begin, and he wondered if he was watching that same instinct play out in real time. Arena masters had decided to change their approach. If swarms and mazes and battle royales could not kill the human, then perhaps a champion could. They sent Gorax. The unbroken Gorax was a legend in the Crucible, and he had won 40 consecutive arena battles without ever suffering a serious wound. He stood 3 meters tall, and his body was covered in gene-forged chitin that could stop plasma bolts. Carried a war axe that weighed as much as Thomas's entire body, and he had used it to split open the hulls of starships. The crowd roared when Gorax entered the arena. This was what they had come to see. This was a true champion. Thomas watched from across the arena floor as the massive creature raised its axe to the crowd and accepted their worship. He felt nothing. He had faced things that scared him before, and Gorax was not one of them. The creature was big and strong and armored, but it was also slow and arrogant, and those were weaknesses Thomas knew how to exploit. The round began and Gorax charged immediately. His footsteps shook the ground, and his roar echoed off the arena walls. Thomas turned and ran. The crowd booed and jeered and called him a coward. Thomas did not care. He ran toward the far end of the arena where a field of ruins provided cover and concealment. Gorax followed, and he was faster than his size suggested. But Thomas was not trying to outrun him. He was trying to outthink him. Thomas ducked behind a crumbling wall and kept moving and changed direction every few seconds. Gorax crashed through the wall without slowing, but Thomas was already gone. This continued for several minutes, and Gorax grew more and more frustrated. He could smell the human and hear the human's heartbeat with his enhanced senses, but every time he got close, the human slipped away. Stand and fight, coward. Gorax, bellowed Thomas. Did not answer. He was counting his steps and measuring distances and building a map of the ruins in his mind. He needed a clear shot, and he needed the right angle, and he needed Gorax to be exactly where he wanted him. The moment came 3 minutes. Later, Gorax burst through a doorway and found himself in an open courtyard with no cover. Thomas was on a rooftop 200 meters away. Their eyes met. Gorax raised his axe and prepared to charge. Thomas raised his rifle. The shot crossed the distance. In less than a second, it struck Gorax in his left eye and passed through his brain and exited through the back of his skull. The champion of 40 victories fell without making a sound. His body hit the ground and did not move. The arena went silent, completely and utterly silent. 50,000 spectators sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Commander Thomas rose slowly from his throne. Impossible, Sub-Commander Yeel whispered. The human's weapon should not be able to penetrate Gorax's chitin. It did not need to, Thomas said quietly. The human did not aim for the armor, and he aimed for the only weak point and the eye. From 200 meters, with a weapon that has no targeting assistance. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, down. In the arena, the other conscripts emerged from their hiding places and gathered around the body of Gorax. They looked up at Thomas, who was climbing down from his rooftop perch. The Krethar, who had lost its arm in the first round, spoke first. How? Did you know where to aim, human? Thomas slung his rifle over his shoulder and walked toward the group. Everything has a weakness, he said. You just have to be patient enough to find it. And the running and the hiding. I was not hiding, Thomas said. I was hunting, and there is a difference. The Krethar made a sound of understanding. You let him think he was the predator. Yes, and all the while you were leading him to the place where you wanted him. Thomas nodded. My people have a saying, and it goes like this, and I am paraphrasing, but it means the same thing in the end. He looked at the body of Gorax and then up at the silent crowd. It does not matter how big the enemy is, or how strong, or how well armored, and what matters is whether you can outthink them. And if you cannot, Thomas met the Krethar's eyes, then you outlast them. The silence in the arena stretched on and on. Commander Thomas sat back in his throne and stared at the human with something he had not felt in 300 years. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion. It was Fernet. Fear of the human's weapon, or even the human's skill. It was fear of what the human represented, a species that had no advantages, and yet refused to accept defeat, a species that had been conquered, and yet still believed it could win, a species that faced gods and monsters with nothing but patience and determination, and an ancient weapon made of wood and steel. Thus had conquered 1,000 worlds, and he had always believed that superior technology guaranteed victory. Human was making him question that belief, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. They mocked the human's old-school rifle until the alien arena went silent and the commander stood up. The arena masters held an emergency meeting after Gorax fell. They had never lost a champion to a conscript before, and the fact that it was a human with a primitive weapon made it even worse. The crowds were talking, and the betting houses were in chaos, and the reputation of the crucible itself was at stake. Something had to be done. They made a decision that had not been made in 300 years. They would release the Vorkath. Announcement came over the arena speakers, and the crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers and screams. Some spectators began to leave because they did not want to see what was about to happen. Others pushed forward to get better views because they knew they were about to witness history. Thomas heard the name and saw the reactions and knew that this was different from everything that had come before. He found the Krethar in the conscript holding area and asked what a Vorkath was. The alien's face went pale, which Thomas had not thought possible for a creature with blue skin. It is death, human. The Krethar said, pure and simple death. Tell me more. The Vorkath is a bioengineered killing machine, and it was created by the Dominion's greatest scientists specifically for the Crucible. What does it look like? 15 meters tall and covered in armor that can stop plasma and fast despite its size and strong enough to tear through walls like they were paper. Thomas processed this information weaknesses. The Crethor laughed, but there was no humor in it. None that anyone has ever found, and it has killed every champion sent against it for 3 centuries. Everything has a weakness, not. The Vorkith human, and I'm sorry, but this is where your journey ends. Thomas said nothing and walked away to prepare. He checked his rifle and cleaned each part with careful attention, counted his remaining ammunition, and found he had 63 rounds left. He closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather and his father, and the men who had carried this rifle before him. They had faced impossible odds too. They had fought enemies with better weapons and greater numbers, and they had won. Because they refused to accept defeat, Thomas would do the same. The arena floor was cleared of all obstacles for the final round. There would be no cover and no hiding places and nowhere to run. The 4 surviving conscripts stood in the center of the open sand and waited for the doors to open. The Siluran was trembling so badly it could barely stand. One of the other conscripts was praying in a language Thomas did not recognize. Only the Crethor stood steady, and it looked at Thomas with something like resignation. It was an honor to fight beside you, human. It said, "We are not dead yet." Thomas replied. The doors began to open. Sound that came from behind them was like nothing Thomas had ever heard. It was a roar and a scream and a rumble all at once, and it made his bones vibrate and his teeth ache. Then the Vorkith emerged, and Thomas understood why the Crethor had called it death. It was massive beyond anything he had imagined. The creature moved on 4 legs, as thick as tree trunks, and its body was covered in plates of black armor that gleamed under the arena lights. Its head was a nightmare of teeth and tusks and 3 eyes that burned with red firearms ending in claws. The length of swords hung from its shoulders, and a tail, tipped with a blade, swept the sand behind it. The crowd screamed in terror and delight. The Vorkith screamed back, then it charged. Siluran broke first, and it tried to flee toward the arena walls. The Vorkith caught it in 3 strides, and the creature's claws tore the alien apart, so fast that Thomas barely saw it happen. The praying conscript was next, and it stood frozen in shock as the Vorkith's jaws closed around its body. The Crethor roared and charged the monster with all 4 arms swinging. It managed to land 2 blows before the Vorkith's tail swept around and cut the alien in half. Thomas ran. He did not run away from the Vorkith, but toward the arena walls. The creature noticed and turned to pursue, and Thomas could feel the ground shaking. With each of its steps, he was faster for now, but he knew he could not outrun it forever. He needed a plan. His eyes scanned the arena as he ran, and his mind worked faster than it had ever worked before. The walls were too smooth to climb, and there was no cover anywhere on the sand, but above the arena floor, the observation platforms jutted out like shelves. They were held up by massive supports that anchored them to the walls. Thomas changed direction and headed toward the largest platform directly beneath Commander Thos's booth. The Vorkith followed and gained ground with every stride. Thomas could hear its breath now and feel the heat of it on his back. He reached the wall and spun around and raised his rifle. The Vorkith opened its jaws and prepared to bite him in half. Thomas did not aim at the creature. He aimed up. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Each one struck a different support beam, holding up the observation platform. Metal screamed and stone cracked, and the entire structure began to collapse. 50 tons of debris came crashing down onto the Vorkith's head. Creature tried to dodge, but it was too big and too slow, and the falling platform caught it perfectly. Impact shook the entire arena, and a cloud of dust rose up and blocked everything from view. Silence fell, complete and absolute silence. The crowd held its breath and waited, and nobody dared to make a sound. The dust began to settle. The Vorkith lay beneath the rubble, with its skull crushed and its body broken, and its 3 red eyes dark and lifeless. Standing 5 meters away, covered in dust but completely unharmed, was Thomas Mercer. He held his rifle in his hands, and smoke rose from its barrel, and he stood alone in the middle of the arena, surrounded by death. He looked up at the crowd, and 50,000 aliens stared back at him. Nobody cheered, nobody booed, nobody made any sound at all. Thomas had done the impossible. He had killed the unkillable. He had beaten death itself with a weapon that was older than their civilization and simpler than their children's toys. In the command booth, Commander Thomases stood at the window and looked down at the human. His officers stood behind him, and they too were silent. Sub-Commander Yale finally spoke. "Commander, what do we do?" Thomas did not answer immediately, was looking at the human and remembering everything he had learned about the species. Persistence. Predators, creatures that never stopped and never gave up and never accepted defeat. He had thought that conquering Earth would be simple because humans had no advanced technology and no natural weapons. He was beginning to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. "Commander," Yale said again, "the human has won, and by the rules of the Crucible he must face you." Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, he must. He turned away from the window and began walking toward the stairs that led down to the arena floor. "Commander, you cannot," Yale said, and there was panic in her voice. "No commander has set foot on the sand in 300 years. Then it is time to break tradition." Thomas said. He did not look back. Walked down the stairs alone, and he thought about the human waiting for him below for the first time in his 300 years of life. Commander Varric Thomases was not certain he would win. They mocked the human's old-school rifle until the alien arena went silent, and the commander stood up. Thomas watched the commander descend the long stairs from the observation booth. Each step echoed through the silent arena, and 50,000 spectators held their breath as their leader walked toward the human who had destroyed their greatest weapon. Commander Varric Thomases was tall even by the standards of his species, and his scales were the color of burnished gold. He wore armor that had been forged in the heart of a dying star, and he carried no visible weapons because he had never needed them. His presence alone had ended wars. Thomas did not move as the commander approached. He kept his rifle at rest across his chest and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing led to death. Thomas stopped 5 meters away, and for a long moment the two simply looked at each other. "You should kneel," Thomas said, and his voice carried across the arena without effort. "That is the tradition, and survivors of the Crucible kneel before the commander and beg for mercy or a clean death." Thomas met his eyes. "I am not going to kneel." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. No one had ever refused a commander's command in the arena. "You understand that I could have you killed with a single word," Thomas said. "Yes, and yet you still refuse." "Yes." Thomas tilted his head slightly, and his golden eyes studied the human with new interest. "Why?" Thomas considered the question for a moment. "Because my people do not kneel to tyrants, and we do not beg for mercy from those who enslave us, and we do not accept defeat, even when we are beaten. You are beaten, human, and your world is conquered, and your people are scattered. And you stand alone in an arena surrounded by enemies." "I am not beaten," Thomas said quietly. "I am still standing, and as long as I am standing, I am not beaten." The silence stretched between them. Thomas took a step closer, and Thomas's hands tightened on his rifle, but he did not raise it. "That weapon," Thomas said. "Tell me about it." Thomas looked down at the rifle in his hands. "It was made in 1903 by my people's calendar, and that was over 100 years before your ships appeared in our sky. It is primitive. Yes, our weapons are superior in every way, and they fire faster and hit harder and never need to be reloaded." "Yes, then why do you carry it?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was soft, but it carried through the silent arena. "My grandfather carried this rifle in a war called the First World War, and he was 17 years old, and he was scared every single day, but he never stopped fighting. He survived. He did, and he brought the rifle home with him. And he passed it to my father, who carried it in another war, and my father was scared too, but he also never stopped fighting. And now you carry it. Yes. Why did you refuse the advanced weapons we offered? Thomas looked up at the commander. Because this rifle is not just a weapon, and it is a promise. What kind of promise? My grandfather promised his mother he would come home, and he did. And my father promised his wife he would come home, and he did. And I promised my squad that I would find a way home no matter what it took. He lifted the rifle slightly. Every time I hold this, I remember that promise, and I remember that the men who came before me faced impossible odds and won because they refused to give up. Thomas's was silent. You could have taken a plasma rifle, he said finally. You would have had more firepower and more ammunition, and your chances of survival would have been significantly higher. Maybe, Thomas acknowledged, but I would have been fighting with your weapon and your rules and your way of war. And instead, I fought with my weapon and my rules and my way of war, and that is the only reason I am still alive. Thomas has made a sound that might have been a laugh. You are saying that your primitive weapon gave you an advantage over our advanced technology. No, Thomas said. I am saying that you gave me an advantage by underestimating me. The words hung in the air. Every opponent I faced looked at this rifle and saw a joke, and they saw an antique. And they saw a weapon that could not possibly threaten them, and that arrogance killed them. You are calling us arrogant. I am calling you blind, Thomas said, and there was no anger in his voice, only truth. You have conquered 1,000 worlds with your technology, and you have come to believe that technology is the only thing that matters. But it is not. Then, what matters? Thomas tapped his chest with one hand. This and what is in here, and the will to keep fighting when everything says you should give up. You speak of spirit. I speak of humanity, Thomas said. My people have been fighting wars since before we learned to write, and we have fought with sticks and stones and swords and guns, and we have won and lost and learned and adapted. He took a step forward, and Thomas's did not step back. You want to know why I survived the Crucible, and it was not because of this rifle, and it was because of 10,000 years of war that taught my species one lesson above all others. And what lesson is that? Thomas met the commander's golden eyes. That the most dangerous creature in any fight is not the one with the best weapon or the strongest armor or the greatest numbers, and the most dangerous creature is the one that will never, ever stop. The arena was so quiet that Thomas could hear his own heartbeats. Stood motionless, and his ancient eyes held an expression that Thomas could not read. Then slowly, the commander did something that had never been done in the history of the Crucible. He stepped back, he lowered his head. You are free to go human. The crowd erupted in shock, and outraged spectators screamed and threw things, and guards moved forward with weapons raised at, held up one hand, and everything stopped. This human has earned his freedom by right of combat, and any who challenge this decision challenge me. No one move. Doss looked at Thomas one final time. Go back to your people, human, and tell them what happened here, and tell them that the Dominion has reconsidered its assessment of your species. What does that mean? Thomas's was quiet for a long moment. It means we will not be returning to your world, and it means we made a mistake, and it means that perhaps there are some species that cannot be conquered no matter how primitive they may appear. He turned and began walking back toward the stairs. Commander, Thomas called out. Haas stopped but did not turn around. What happens now, and to the Crucible, and to the other conscripts from other worlds? The commander was silent for so long that Thomas thought he would not answer. I do not know human, he said finally. Perhaps that is something I need to consider. He resumed walking and climbed the stairs without looking back. Thomas stood alone in the arena surrounded by the silence of 50,000 aliens who were only now beginning to understand what they had. Witnessed a human had entered the crucible with nothing but an ancient weapon and a refusal to die, and he had won. Thomas slung his grandfather's rifle over his shoulder and walked toward the arena. Exit. He did not look at the crowd. He did not celebrate. He simply walked with the same patient determination that had carried him through every challenge at the entrance to the arena. He stopped and turned back for one final look. The Vorkith's body still lay beneath the rubble, and the sand was stained with the blood of a dozen species, and the silence was slowly being replaced by whispers that would become stories, that would become legends. Thomas thought about his squad and the promise he had made to them. He thought about his grandfather and his father and the rifle they had passed down through generations. He thought about Earth and the war that was not over, and the battles that were still to come. Then he turned and walked out of the crucible and into a future that was uncertain, but no longer hopeless. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. The humans had seemed so weak. They had seemed so primitive. They had seemed like easy prey. But the crucible had revealed the truth that the Dominion had been too arrogant to see humanity was not weak. Humanity was patient, and that made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy.